Tonight is week 5 of 6, so we have one more after this. And that is part of the plan. This was a 6-week course. We had a 9-week course at the beginning of the year. If you're in high school here and you're thinking maybe to go to college around the area, we'd love to have you back for more apologetics courses. And the reason why I specifically share that with you is because, and probably why Mr. Rassman asked you to come for your extra credit, is to get you a little bit more exposure to this. Because as you probably know, most college students, I think it's around like 70% or so of college students wind up walking away from Christianity during their time at college. And it's not necessarily because of a college professor who's a strong atheist and wants to deconvert you, but it's also because of the plethora of cultural worldviews that you'll be exposed to while studying from classmates and different things like that. And I can attest to you from firsthand experience that that was the case with me. And so I wound up having quite a journey through doubts and skepticism. And I imagine that you'll start encountering your own skeptical self and start realizing that there's some things that aren't so cut and dry as maybe your youth group or previous pastors once have shared. So I don't want to scare you or anything, but things aren't that simple. And I think when you start studying it a little bit more and gravitate to more of a nuanced worldview and a sophisticated understanding of philosophy and the scriptures, I imagine you'll find that things get pretty complex really quick, and the answers are take a little digging. So, having said that, don't be surprised if you find yourself questioning what you once thought. And this sort of a class, and the class that you're taking now at Crean High School, is gearing you up well. But more is coming, and it's only going to get harder and harder. So welcome to you. And for those who are familiar with the class, welcome back. And there's a lot of new people and friends of friends here, so welcome to everybody. There are these notebooks. If you're new, hopefully you can share with your neighbor that brought you. We'll go through these pretty thoroughly, but the whole idea is that they're just a supplement so you don't have to take a lot of notes. So if you are here and you don't have that spiral-bound book in front of you, just follow along as you would in any other class, and you'll be fine. The PowerPoint is very basic. All I'm doing up here is just showing you kind of the bigger topic that we're on, and then this won't have any of the detailed information that we'll be talking through. So don't rely on the PowerPoint to show you much, other than if you get lost, you'll know where you're at. Okay, so having said all that, there's a new class coming. Originally, I was going to be teaching after a 3-week break after this class, just like we did last class. But it turns out that because I have to take another class myself, my friend, he happens to be a friend of mine, is going to teach this class. So if you want to look at what's in front of you there, it's a flyer on forming a Christian worldview. And Dr. Rich Park is a friend of mine, and he just graduated from Oxford. So the guy is brilliant, and I highly encourage you to take this. Now, after this worldview class, about practically what it looks like to have a Christian worldview, we're actually going to be talking about worldviews in the fall, in the summer, end of summer, early fall. And then we'll start that worldview class. And so we'll be looking at all the secular worldviews that, for instance, you'll encounter on a college campus, and we'll be trying to show that the charges against these worldviews that are secular are successful. And so therefore one ought to reject a secular worldview because the component worldviews of the secular worldview fail. And we do that by just looking at tons of things. philosophy and critical thinking and things like that. Well, this class is a little different, and it really sets up that class well. So it's a good precursor, and I highly recommend it. So Rich may be here a little bit later to talk to us about that. So if he's here, he'll come up and share a little bit more. All right. So that's happening. So the other reason, just so you know, personal here, I'm taking a class with my wife. We're going to be looking at doing a foster care and being foster parents. So that's Thursday nights in June and July. So that's why I won't be teaching the class I was originally scheduled to teach. So depending on what happens there, we may be foster parents. Who knows? So keep that in prayer. Keep that in mind if you think about it. Okay, other announcements. I have this really cool book. It's called The Gospels, and it's got actual photographs of Jesus and the disciples in here, just like the one on the cover there of your spiral-bound book. And I wanted to show it to you in case you ever were curious about what they look like. Here's exactly what they look like. And if anybody says these guys didn't exist, it's like, hello, I mean, we have their photo. So anyway, you could pass that around. It's actually a pretty cool book. It's got some cool things in it. And then I'll talk a little bit about these two books. These two books are kind of the hallmark books, if you will. They're the biggest and the best apologetics books on the resurrection. And this one only has the resurrection for a couple chapters. It's William Lane Craig, Reasonable Faith. He's well known for his debates on YouTube. He's kind of a YouTube phenomena, which is weird for like a professional philosopher and scholar, but he happens to be heavily downloaded or heavily watched on YouTube because of his debates with so many atheists. And Craig has some good chapters in here on the resurrection. Now, he wrote a full book on the resurrection, but it's more of a scholarly book, and it doesn't look like this. It's kind of just got, you know, a blank cover or a weird-looking cover. So this is one that you'll see more often float around, and he's got some great stuff on the resurrection, of course. And then there's N.T. Wright. Who's here heard of N.T. Wright? Okay, about half of us. So N.T. Wright is a British scholar, historian, New Testament guy. The guy, he wrote 2 volumes before this. This is about 800 pages, maybe 750 or so. And he wrote about the same size, just on Jesus, 2 other volumes before that. So he's got, this is the 3rd volume in a set of, in a 3-volume set. And so this one's just on the resurrection. The other 2 are just on Jesus. And so I'll pass these around. Obviously, I haven't read all of these, but I read some things in there and watched the video. No, I'm kidding. But no, those are great resources. So I encourage you, if you ever want to do more study on the resurrection, which is our topic for tonight, those 2 books are the best books to start with. They are the main books on the resurrection. So, and then there's a 3rd guy, Gary Habermas. Gary Habermas teaches at Liberty University. He's a distinguished professor, and he is on the cusp of releasing probably about 1,000, 2,000 page book or set of books on the resurrection alone. And this would be his 30 years worth of research on the resurrection. And Gary Habermas would be the 3rd guy I would recommend you check out for more on this topic. So there's that. Some more resources for you. And last week we finished up the outline, or got close to finishing it. We were talking about Apollonius of Tyana. Do you remember that? And we went through about 15 minutes of that, and we kind of didn't finish. Well, I didn't want to necessarily go back into that and finish it tonight because there was only a little bit of that left. And instead, I wanted to talk through all of these pages on the resurrection that you have in front of you. So we're going to do that this week and next week. Also, last week, if you remember, there is another criticism that talked about ancient mystery religions and Mithraism as one of the ancient mystery religions. You could see it towards the end of your last section we went through, page 101 on the top, actually, or page 100 on the top upper right-hand corner. And we didn't go through that criticism, but tonight there's actually a little portion in this resurrection outline that does go back and talk about these ancient mystery religions. And what I gave you in the back, in the drop folder there in the bin, is a 17-page or so outline on mystery religions and Mithraism. And so we'll cover it in brief tonight, but this is going to be the handout that says, when it says see handout, that's the handout. So this is the handout that's pointed out in page 101, page 10 of 10 of last week's outline. So you could circle that where it says see handout and then go grab that, and that'll be the thing that you can put into your 3-ring binder. Okay, so that's some good stuff. All right, so with that, why don't we go ahead and pray and get started. All right, let's pray real quick. Dear God, we thank you for the opportunity to come tonight. We ask that you would guide us and direct our thoughts. Lord, help us to know that you're in control, that you are God, and that you hold the future, and you know what's best for our lives. So God, we thank you for bringing us here to calm our minds and hearts, to help us to understand the historicity and the evidence surrounding the resurrection of your Son. In Jesus' name, amen. Right on. So we're starting in the outline under the tab, if you have that spiral-bound book, the resurrection evidence. And so we're going to be looking at 3 different sections as we go through this, or 4 different sections. And in the PowerPoint above, and on the first page of your notes there, you can see the overall outline. So that's what we're talking about here, the overall outline. So number 1, the importance of this topic is what we'll cover, but we'll do that real quick. So that's just the first little part. But the number 1 thing in the outline that you'll see is the charges against the evidence for Jesus' resurrection are easily rejected. So that's the first kind of subtopic we'll be spending time on. Number 2, the alternative theories explaining the evidence or explaining away Jesus' resurrection have challenges that cannot be overcome. That's the second area we'll cover. And third, the evidence provides a compelling case for a historical resurrection event, which is the theory with the most explanatory power and scope. Okay, so that's basically where we're going today. And as we will start, you'll see more of that. Okay, so first we'll talk about the importance of this topic. So why talk about the evidence for the resurrection? Why bother talking about that? I mean, can't we just have faith and move on? Well, among those who rarely attend church, sorry, I lost my thing. Okay. Among those who rarely or never attend church, 46% believe Jesus rose from the dead. Only 46%. This was a recent poll done by Rasmussen, I think is how you pronounce it. So that means 45% do not believe Jesus resurrected. That's a lot of people. So skepticism is quite high concerning this. Recently, popular and scholarly criticisms have erupted in books, radio, and online. And so these aren't new, because some of them, with the asterisk in your notes there, indicates that there's some ancient criticisms that Christian thinkers back then responded to. And so when you see the little asterisk in your outline, that's what's going on, is that Christians of that era had already responded to that. So the first thing you may hear, or one of the things you may hear people say is, don't you get it? Crucified people were left to hang there on the cross till the birds pecked away at most of their face. Kind of graphic, I know. The corpse would have been thrown into a mass grave, only to be consumed by wild dogs. They weren't buried in tombs, and Joseph of Arimathea is made up. Many people say this. Other things people say go like this. There are contradictions and inconsistencies in the empty tomb accounts, and they can't be trusted. Different women, guards versus no guards, rock versus no rock, one angel versus no angel versus two angels, before sunrise versus after sunrise. So there's these conflicting accounts provided in the Gospels, and we're not quite sure which one's right. And maybe these alleged inconsistencies point to the fact that the Gospels are not reliable. Well, that's a good challenge. What about this one? So maybe the tomb was empty. So what? No one actually saw him rise. No one actually saw him get up from being in the lying down position and rise and awaken. Well, that's a good challenge as well. What about this? Honestly, anybody can break into a tomb and steal a body. We do it all the time. I don't know if you hear people say that, but if they do, watch out. We do it all the time. Or the disciples stole the body while the guards were sleeping. So you may have heard that one. The disciples stole the body while the guards were sleeping. What about this? Because Mark's gospel cuts off leaving the reader with questions, the disciples later reported that Jesus rose from the grave. So they had this document, this book of Mark, that was being circulated around, and Mark cuts off without the appearances of Jesus. So what do the disciples do? Well, they start saying, okay, let's fill in the blanks. What happened after this? There's this empty tomb, so what should we say about it? Oh, well, Jesus resurrected. Okay, well, that's a good criticism. What about this? The resurrection was made up to continue the story of their dead mentor. They just didn't want Jesus to die. They just kept him alive in their hearts. So they made up the resurrection. Maybe. Okay. Next criticism. The disciples preached and died for fame, power, and position in an emerging institution. So here you have the disciples knowing that the church is going to explode and get big, and all of a sudden they just say, hey, we should go to our deaths for this, because we want to be known. We want to be famous. Okay, all right, maybe. What about this? Jesus' resurrection was only spiritual in nature and not physical. The body remained dead, but Jesus rose again spiritually speaking. You may have heard people say that. What about this? They were hallucinating. They were hallucinating, just like when we are smoking weed. We have visions of dead folks all the time, especially when we're on drugs. Well, of course the disciples hallucinated. We do it all the time. No problem. We figured it out. They conjured up these dreams in the midst of their emotional despair, like many do when loved ones pass. And I'm sure we can all attest to these times of grief and sorrow and pain and suffering, and we've had dreams of the people that we're grieving and that we lost. So that's just a natural reaction. So they just dreamed of an appearance of Jesus. What about this? If the tomb was empty, why doesn't Paul mention it in his creedal form in 1 Corinthians 15? Why didn't Peter mention it in his Acts sermon on Pentecost? If the tomb was empty, why didn't they say something about it when they had the chance? Okay, what about this? The disciples just borrowed from other resurrected other stories. The disciples chose to create a story because there were other stories around. These pagan mystery religions had some good material and good stories, and they just borrowed from that. Yeah, that's a good criticism. So here you have all of these criticisms. These criticisms you may hear online, on Facebook, in forums, wherever, on the street, at Starbucks, on the college campus. What do we do with these criticisms? Well, here we have the big issue. We have a skepticism that traditionally in the church we don't have answers to. We have something that hits us hard and we're not sure how to respond traditionally. Christians just typically aren't very good at talking about this amazing treasure that we have in terms of apologetics. We have a wealth of resources here on the resurrection. And it's really important that we know the evidence for the resurrection and not just believe the resurrection happened because someone told us it happened, because this happens to be the pinnacle point of our faith. Without the resurrection of Jesus, the following is true. Jesus is not God. Without the resurrection, Jesus is not the Messiah. Without the resurrection, we are still dead in our sins, and there is no way to God or heaven. Without the resurrection, our faith is in vain. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of energy. It's a waste of money. Without the resurrection, Christianity is based on a lie and not facts of history. And the doctrines of Christianity ought to be rejected. No one ought to be a Christian. No one ought to be a Christian if the resurrection did not happen. No one ought to be a Christian. No rationally minded person, no human being for that matter, should be a Christian without the resurrection. The resurrection is huge. Christianity lives or dies on the hill of the resurrection. And amazingly enough, this is the gold mine of apologetics. This is the best apologetic we have because there's so much evidence for the resurrection. And hopefully some of that will come out as we chat through this. So, we're first going to look at the charges against the resurrection of Jesus. So, the charges against the evidence for the resurrection. These charges are easily rejected. They're easily rejected. They sound strong, but there's easy ways to respond to them. Let's look at charge number 1. Don't you get it? Crucified people were left to hang there on the cross till the birds pecked away most of their face. The corpse would have been thrown into a mass grave only to be consumed by wild dogs. They weren't buried in tombs, the crucified victims. And this Joseph of Arimathea guy, he would not have first ruled on his death and then taken the body and put it in a tomb. It doesn't make sense that somebody would do that. So let me ask the class, before you look further, how would you respond to this? Some of you have studied evidence for the resurrection already. Some of you haven't. But let's just hear from you real quick. What immediately comes to mind? What would you say at this point if you heard this sort of a charge? Yeah, Sharon. Okay.
When you're talking about hallucinations and dreams, those are individual, personal things that happen. People don't have the same dream, the same hallucination.
Yeah.
And the fact that you have 500 people testifying to the same thing is absolute proof that it's true.
Okay, good. That's great. Let's. You guys are saying some amazing answers, so you get an A+. But I want people to give us a response here. Yeah, Dan.
Well, normally common criminals were crucified, and Jesus was not your typical crucifixion victim.
Okay.
So they brought him down because of Passover. They didn't want him up there. Yet this particular criminal had significance.
Okay.
That's why it was not the norm.
Interesting. Yeah, this particular criminal had significance, so he wouldn't have the traditional mass burial like maybe the other criminals. Yeah.
I would want to know what their authority is, what they cited for their authority.
Great question. Yeah. Where are you getting this from? Show me some sources. Yeah, others. Carrie.
Also, Joseph of Arimathea wasn't just some guy, he was a member of the Sanhedrin, and he didn't approve of Jesus' crucifixion.
Ah.
So it makes sense for him to want to honor the man who was killed.
Ah. Good, good, good. Others? Tokes, yeah.
I was going to say, the Bible said that he would wait till the person died, but he was dead, because it did say he died, and then they took the body. But he died before the other criminals, so they took him off the cross.
Mm.
They had to break their joints,
Mm-hmm.
fingers, and their legs, so that they would die. It wasn't to die, so he died raised in blood on the cross.
Okay. Yeah, so it was different than the other guys he was crucified with, and they probably would have been taken to the mass grave. But because there's some special circumstances, if we can put it that way, he had a little different scenario that likely unfolded. Yeah.
Wasn't there some Jewish festival going on, and that's why they had to take his body down? And
Yeah.
Because they didn't want dead people being during the Jewish festival. I remember it.
Yes. Absolutely. Great point. What's your name? Samuel. Great point, Samuel. So yeah, Passover, right? Passover was taking place, and they wanted to get that body off the cross as soon as possible, right? As was the Jewish custom to do. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Lisa.
Also, Joseph, you're saying, okay, they invented Joseph. Joseph wasn't by himself when they went to get the body, so it's not like he was all there by himself to put the body in the grave. And then he wasn't the only one probably either in the Sanhedrin that didn't vote for his death.
Yeah. Okay, so we have another person saying that Joseph wasn't there when they voted for his death. Now, maybe some brave soul could look that up in the accounts. Who would be interested in doing that? Was Joseph there when they voted to have Jesus crucified? Tokes, can you do that?
I remember that it said he didn't agree.
He didn't agree with it? Yeah. What verse is that? I'm trying to think of the verse. Maybe somebody could look that up for me. Wilton, would you mind looking that up? Where Joseph of Arimathea wasn't there? Let's go ahead and walk through some of this. Some of you have already said what we have here in the material. So, but for those who couldn't hear, we'll walk through some of this. First of all, it is true, common burial graves were typical for most crucified criminals, but not for all criminals. And in this case, Joseph of Arimathea, a rich member of the Sanhedrin, who did not consent to the action against Christ, and we're looking up which verse says that, took the body and laid him in a tomb that he owned nearby. So this is cool. That's good news. Now, it really gets interesting here. We have no other accounts of Jesus' burial. We don't have someone saying that Jesus was actually buried back in Nazareth, where he was from, or Jesus was actually dropped off in the Sea of Galilee to swim with the fishes or whatever. We don't have anything like that. If Jesus' body was actually placed elsewhere, the Jews would most likely have written about it. The Jews especially, because they were already against Christianity. And so they would want to come up with another burial account if there was one. But not surprisingly, no other burial accounts can be found. And this implies that the only account we have is the right account, and others knew that it was accurate. So it's interesting that we have Joseph of Arimathea, who is on essentially the enemy's strategic team, strategic planning committee. He was the one that they said was the person that took Jesus down. Now, it's highly improbable that the early Christians would have invented a member of the ruling council to give Jesus a proper burial when all the disciples deserted him. They should have followed through with the burial, but instead they credited another, especially one who is on the enemy council. So if you're the disciples and you deserted your master and you deserted your mentor, and then you wanted to write about it, why would you put somebody else as the one who did the right thing that you should have done in the story? Why wouldn't you put yourself in there to make yourself look good? Well, they didn't give credit to themselves because they wanted to tell the truth. That makes the most sense of why Joseph of Arimathea is in there. Now, he's mentioned in all 4 Gospels. The Sanhedrin could have denied his existence, but they didn't. Why? Because Joseph of Arimathea was real. We don't have the Sanhedrin denying the existence of Joseph of Arimathea. And additionally, the Jews knew who the members of the Sanhedrin were. The Jews in Jerusalem and all around knew who those guys are. The way they dressed, they were public figures, and were a very distinguished group. If the disciples wanted to make up a figure, they would have created an obscure, random person from some far-off region, and they would have said some random guy that was traveling from Persia to Rome. He came through and he was just a super nice guy, and he just wanted to help out this Jesus guy, and he actually put him in this tomb, and Jesus resurrected. They would have made somebody up like that if they wanted to. They would not have invented a person and placed him in a small group of recognizable men. So in other words, if Joseph of Arimathea was made up, it doesn't make any sense because they placed Joseph of Arimathea, this figure, in this group of very recognizable people. It's like saying that somebody on the Lakers gave Jesus a proper burial. Well, you can look at the Lakers and you can say, God, there's only 10 guys on the team, and I know who they all are. So, and one of them happens to be named Joseph of Arimathea, oddly enough. Now, that'd be a weird name for an NBA player, but you get the idea. It's a recognizable group, and you can clearly know who's in and who's not in. So the reason why they identified a particular person was because that particular person actually did it. People who read the Gospels could have looked up Joseph for themselves to question him. And we don't have an alternative report of Joseph being questioned and denying this fact. So it makes sense to say that in light of the fact that there's not an alternative report, that we're on good grounds in saying that Joseph of Arimathea we don't know if he denied ever doing this, but he was obviously around after the Gospels were written to be questioned. In fact, we have the report from the Pharisees themselves who went to the tomb to seal it and had guards placed there that they asked Pilate to bring on and put around the tomb to protect it. So even the ruling council who sentenced Jesus were immediately aware and intimately aware of the tomb Joseph placed Jesus in. So we have this enemy council knowing exactly where that tomb is and exactly who's in it and exactly whose tomb it is. So we have the Pharisees saying that, oh yeah, we know about that tomb. We know Joseph put him in there. In fact, we're going to put a seal on it, and we're going to ask these guards to guard it because we don't want any rumors to spread. We don't want anything happening here. We don't want anybody to say that the body is taken out of the tomb. So, Wayne.
One thing that isn't mentioned here, there were some pretty strict consequences if Roman soldiers lost what they were supposed to be guarding.
Sure.
So if Jesus somehow got stolen, they were sleeping, all of them, and nobody noticed anything, they would be put to death, right?
Great point. Yeah, there were some strict regulations upon the soldiers when they failed to perform a task. There's some immediate consequence, So the fact that we have a enemy council saying, yes, that is the place where Jesus is, says so much. Because when you have enemy at a station, it adds significant weight to the veracity of the claim. So if you're Napoleon and you're crossing some river and your historian's writing about that in a sequence of a battle, and the other historian on the enemy side is also writing that Napoleon crossed that same river on the same time and so forth, then you have independent corroborating evidence that shows that this claim is weighty and there's truth to it. So, archaeology is another place we can turn to. If you remember the biblical archaeological class we had in the biblical apologetics class series, we talked a lot about archaeology, and it turns out that around Jerusalem, there are these rich family tombs in the region. And so there is, in fact, gardens that were found to be around these tombs. And so this corresponds to the incidental details given in the gospel accounts that Joseph was rich and the tomb was in a garden near the crucifixion site just outside of Jerusalem. So thus the account is corroborated externally through archaeology. And additional archaeological finds include the tombs of prominent Jewish high priests, actually, near the area just outside Jerusalem's Garden Gate. So this is very important. It's highly likely that Jesus' body was placed in a tomb near their tombs in the garden area just outside of Jerusalem. So the evidence points to a burial of Jesus in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Now, this is very important because once you have Jesus in the tomb, you only have two options. Once this is an established fact, you only have two options from there. You have Jesus is still in the tomb, or Jesus is not in the tomb. And this is very important, obviously, for as we go through the rest of this series. So as we go through these charges, we're actually going to be looking at evidence as we walk through this and kind of building a case, if you will, secondarily speaking. Any questions on the response to the first charge here before we move to number 2? Yeah, Wilton.
You ready for the sites?
Yeah.
It's in Luke 23:50
Luke 23:50
through 56. Also, it's in John. However,
we'll call him J of A, Joseph of Arimathea. Luke 23:50 to 56, that talks about how Joseph of Arimathea was not there when they decided to kill Jesus.
it's John 38. However, in John, it says that
1938.
1938. Oh yeah, there's no 38. What? Okay.
in John it says that he was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because of the fear of the Jews.
Cool.
And in Luke 23, says there was a good and righteous man named Joseph, a member of the Sanhedrin, who had not agreed with their plan and action.
Okay.
He was from Arimathea.
Perfect. That's great. So once you've established Joseph, and once you know a little bit about him, and once you look at archaeology and you start thinking through who is this guy, why is he included, and he comes out of nowhere, by the way, then you have this amazing chunk of evidence about the placement of the body in the tomb. And that's extremely, extremely important. Now, charge number 2. People say this a lot. There are errors and contradictions and inconsistencies in the empty tomb accounts, and they can't be trusted. There's different women that show up in some Gospels and not the others, not the same women in the others. There's guards and there's no guards. There's a rock and there's no rock. There's one angel, then there's 2 angels, and then there's before sunrise they see him, and then there's after sunrise they they see the empty tomb, all this stuff is different. And if you have ever flipped through a Bart Ehrman book, he likes to talk about this. In fact, that's one of his main books, main things he does, is he talks about the fact that the Gospels especially are not reliable. And that he points to different things like this. So what do we do when we see these alleged inconsistencies? Now, we had a whole couple classes on this just a couple months back, so we're not going to repeat all of that here, but we're going to look at a couple things of importance. Number one, even if there are contradicting features, even if there are, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Now, what do we mean by that? We're just saying that there's a core of the story that's the same in each. So you can give up, for the sake of argument, for the moment, if you're in a conversation, you can give up inerrancy as something to debate for that particular moment and just set it aside. Just say, I don't need to debate inerrancy at the moment. Let's say there are some inconsistencies. Let's grant that side of the argument. Okay, now what do we do? Well, number one, we find that the core of the story is the same. So we've moved past this kind of real frustrating issue about the Gospels and the Bible has to be airtight, inerrant, and everything, so that everybody the person that we're talking to can calm down, and then all of a sudden we can say, look, the core of the story is the same. Joseph of Arimathea takes the body out and puts it in the tomb in each of the accounts. We know that. In all of them, that's exactly the same. Who cares all the little incidental details? We know that first point. Number two, the tomb is visited by a small group of women, 2, 3, some small group, followers early on Sunday morning following the crucifixion. The tomb is visited by a small group of women, followers early on Sunday morning following the crucifixion. That's the same in each. And the third thing that's the same is that they find that the tomb is empty, with visions of angels saying that Jesus is risen. That's the same in each. So it doesn't really matter how many angels or how many women or a rock or no rock or a big rock or small rock or whatever, because the core is the same. So once you get past the inerrancy argument and you set that aside, you can really concentrate on this weighty treasure that we have here about the core. So what appeared to be contradictions is actually complementary evidence. Complementary evidence. At the end of the day, all of the alleged contradictions can either be harmonized or accounted for with the appropriate hermeneutics. Hermeneutics, again, just being the right interpretation of the genre that you're reading. So what appears to be alleged contradictions is actually complementary, because there's ways to understand the certain alleged discrepancies there. If the stories were all the same, it would have been harder for us to believe, as they could have gotten together and decided what the appropriate public relations report would need to be. And they could be guilty, in this case, of collusion and conspiracy. So it's very good, actually, that we have these almost conflicting stories of the same thing, because you're hearing raw, authentic testimony from the eyes of the people there, reported just as they saw it, without fabrication. So it makes the evidence much more reliable and trustworthy, because we have the impression that they were trying their best to tell the truth as they saw it and emphasize the things that they wanted to emphasize. And they wanted to point out certain things that they thought were important to the audience they were speaking to. John and Matthew and Luke had different audiences. So it's important to realize that maybe they were communicating to a certain type of people, and they were trying to communicate a certain thing. John, again, spends a lot of time communicating the divinity of Jesus. Most of what he says in the book of John is all about trying to show how Jesus is in fact God. The other Gospels have similar things. Luke is very concerned about getting the facts of history right and contextualizing the history of Jesus' ministry as he goes around and does his thing. And so Luke was writing to what we think are Gentile believers or just Gentile non-Christians. So he's very concerned about these sorts of things. And so in other words, we need to understand the whole movement behind the gospel accounts and all that comes to the table before we start saying that these things can't be trusted and they're not, they don't collaborate well. Now, you can skip the little mark part right there in your handout and go to the next item there. Outside of the gospel accounts, we still have an empty tomb. So it turns out that Gary Habermas, who I mentioned earlier, he's going to be releasing this life's work of work. I don't know if I'm saying that. His life's work in terms of the resurrection accounts that he's studied over the years. And it's 1,000, 2,000 pages, I'm not quite sure. And he's written extensively on it already. And I guess he's compiling all of those different works into one work. And I think that's available coming out this spring. May already be out. Gary Habermas. And it turns out that in the last 30 years or so, him and his graduate students have researched all of these non-Christian scholars around the world to find out whether or not they hold to the empty tomb, whether or not that they agree to that. And based on 25 to 30 years of looking into this, out of the 2,000 scholars, or out of all the scholars they came across, 2,000 of them agree that the tomb was empty. These are non-Christian historians. And so that's about 75% of all whom they've come across. And that's an amazingly high figure, actually, of scholars who agree on something, especially from the non-Christian perspective. So it's very amazing that we have such independent attestation and independent acceptance outside of the Christian faith of this same truth of history. Now, could we call it a fact of history? I think so, because how do we call other events of history and occurrences of history? How do we call them fact? Well, we do the same thing we're doing now. We look at what the historians say. We look at what the original documents say, the primary sources, and what the documents around them said about those documents. And we look at all of these things, and we could say, yeah, there's a fact that Napoleon was called Emperor of France right after 1800 or so, and he did all these things, and we call that facts of history. The same thing happens here. So we can say that the empty tomb, in my opinion, is a fact based on the historical evidence. So these historians actually agree with what I'm saying, and they say, this guy, historian Michael Grant, he says, true, the discovery of the empty tomb is differently described by the various Gospels, but if we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to any other ancient literary sources, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty. And historian Sir Norman Anderson says, the empty tomb then forms a veritable rock on which all rationalistic theories of the resurrection dash themselves in vain. So all of these other historians are saying, yes, the tomb was empty. They give us that point. They're fine with that. They don't have a problem with that. So if the big-time scholars think that it's okay to accept the empty tomb, then the person on Facebook and YouTube and all these other places should also be okay with the fact that there's an empty tomb. So now, any questions on that before we go to charge number 3?
So there's no video camera.
There was a video camera actually there, but we lost the footage, unfortunately. Yeah.
I
I know this sounds silly, but I can hear the other side saying that they say it's empty because Jesus never existed or he never went in there. So I can hear that argument because I just got into a discussion with someone.
Yeah, well, so that guy obviously is not taking the 99.9% of scholars who agree that Jesus existed into account. I would say, well, if you don't agree with the 99.9% of the scholars on his existence, then you're not going to agree with the 75% of scholars. So, I mean, who's on rational grounds here? So, I would put it that way: say, what is more rational to believe? Something that disagrees with 99% of professional historians and 75% of professional historians? Okay, if you feel like you're on rational grounds to do that, go ahead. But when you're talking about people who've studied this stuff for, their whole life and written dissertations on history and how to do history and the historical method and so forth, I think that I would be pretty shocked, if somebody continued to hold that position. I think that's completely irrational.
Denial, then, what you say?
Yeah, denial, absolutely.
Denial.
Unfortunately, I mean, I think you're right. I think that's the case. Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, if they wanted to make it up and make it stick, they would have sent Peter to the grave instead of women.
Right. That's a great point.
Even testify.
That's such a great point.
Peter's the rock.
That's right. We're going to talk about that in a moment. The power of a woman's testimony.
There isn't any. There was none. And if you made up the story, you wouldn't have the women go and testify that he's risen because they don't have the ability to say that.
Yeah, you guys are stealing my thunder here. Good stuff. Yeah, a woman's voice could change a nation and do so many other wonderful things. Charge number 3. So maybe the tomb was empty. So what? No one actually saw him rise. So let me ask you, what would you say in response to this? Maybe the tomb was empty. So what? Let's agree with the 75% of historians. No one actually saw Jesus rise, so why should we believe it? No one actually saw him get up and actually resurrect. What would you say to that?
He was actually put in the grave.
He was
by
put in the
Joseph
grave.
and others.
Yeah.
The Pharisees sealed him in the tomb.
Yeah, but no one actually saw him rise. So how can we trust the gospel? Samuel.
No one may have seen him rise, but they saw him alive after he obviously died.
Okay.
500.
He had to rise to be alive.
So you have the appearances still, and you can't just throw those away because those actually happen. Yeah.
And even if people saw him and they could make the argument that, that wasn't him that they saw, but that's even refuted because they saw the scars on his hands and his feet and his side when they thrust the spear. So
Yeah. Yeah. They easily can identify the person after death with the person before death. That's a good point. What else? Dan.
The tomb was guarded, so what would their explanation be? How was the tomb empty?
So if he didn't resurrect, then how do you explain the fact that the tomb's empty and there are guards out front? So how did that happen? He must have resurrected. Yeah, Chris.
Maybe I heard the question wrong, but when I heard the defense, for someone to have a tomb, that must mean they must have died. So there's proof at least he existed. So I think I may have heard the question wrong, but
Yeah.
I was saying that if he had a tomb, or if he did, for someone to have a tomb, they have to be alive to have a tomb. But I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah.
Because there's no evidence that he had a tomb.
The tomb
Because
had
it's
a
not in
Roman
a tomb,
seal.
because usually he has a tomb because their body's in it, but his body's not in the tomb. Because he rose. Just responding.
Okay, let's go to the back. Sophia.
Also, like, they would have needed about 5 other men to roll the stone.
Okay, how did if the disciples stole the body and he didn't actually rise and no one was there to see him rise, you still have the issue of how do you get him out of the tomb? Yeah. And you have the guards in front. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
when Jesus resurrected, he got a glorified body. That means he can penetrate to the wall.
Yeah. Okay, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. So
why the stone has to roll, he can even come out of the tomb through the wall.
Yeah. So, okay, great point. So our Dr. John, who's got a PhD in physics, actually has done research on how bodies transport themselves through rock. And so he's got a dissertation on that. Actually, it's a great point. Jesus did not need the tomb to be rolled away to get out of the tomb. He shows up in amongst the disciples later on, and it's not very clear how he shows up in the room that they were meeting in. He probably just transported himself into it. And what scholars refer to when they refer to the body of Jesus, the resurrected body, they refer to it as a transphysical body. In other words, it had properties that we have with our bodies, but it was transphysical, meaning that it had additional properties that we don't have. So think X-Men or something like that, you know. I'm just giving you a sense. But the idea here is that we will have bodies, Paul alludes to this, that we will have bodies in some way that are like his. We're not quite sure what he means in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, we will be sown perishable and raised imperishable. So there's the statements that he has in 1 Corinthians 15 that gives us a sense that we will have a body in some way like his. So let's finish this point here, and then we'll take a break. So yeah, true, the New Testament does not describe somebody actually seeing him rise. But it is necessary, it's not necessary for someone to see it for it to be true or false. Just because no one was there doesn't mean it didn't happen. If no one's in a forest and a tree falls, does somebody hear it? Did it actually fall? Yeah, it actually fell, even though no one heard it. So the actual act of rising does not require an eyewitness for us to believe it. So the New Testament does describe the conditions causing the disciples' belief, an empty tomb and the appearances. So we do have those conditions. They're necessary and sufficient conditions that show us that the disciples' belief was based on an actual occurrence in history. So with that, let's take a quick break, 5 minutes, and we'll come right back, okay? There should be snacks in the back. The other thing I was going to mention is there's a guy here that, you know that thing that happens when you have a friend and you think that they like you more as a friend than you like them as a friend? Well, it's kind of true with me and Rich. He actually likes me much more than I like him. And I don't know how to say it. It's been so awkward this whole time. I mean, he actually invited me to be in his wedding party, and I did it, but I didn't invite him into my wedding party. It was so weird. And then he told me, I should come to his Oxford graduation in England, and I was like, okay, but I didn't invite him to mine. It's just like, I don't know, it's just it's one of those goofy things. Actually, I'm just kidding around. I love this guy to death. I'm actually, I brag about the fact that I know him all over the place. So, oddly enough, coincidentally, Rich and I got to become friends through Apologetics.com, and we've been doing radio shows over the last 6 years or so when he's been here. He's been in Oxford, I guess, for a lot of that time. So, and he just got back, and so he's teaching at Biola as a professor now. So, if you don't mind, would you give me a hand in welcoming Dr. Rich Park? So, Rich is going to share a little bit about the class that you have the flyer for, and it's coming up, and you're going to start pretty soon here, right?
Yeah, it looks like the end of May. And how do you well, it's actually true. I do like Jeremy more than he likes me. I do pray for him. It's not Beijing as well. No, that's already intact. But no, it'd be a privilege for me to have a chance to journey with you through 8 weeks on this whole venture of forming a Christian worldview. It's an area that I really enjoy teaching. I teach a couple classes over at Biola, and one of them is this, related to this whole topic of forming a Christian worldview. And it's the class I enjoy most. So yeah, we'll be looking at different themes. Let's see what I'll be teaching on. But it really is taking a strong sort of grasp of these doctrines of creation, fall, and redemption, which fill out the bulk of the Christian worldview, and then applying those to our everyday life and saying, well, what does it mean to think Christianly about, honestly, everything from, well, how about this? What do we count as Christian music versus secular music? And that's an odd kind of question to ask theologically, but that's actually a very important one as we think about the whole of society. So this morning, in fact, this afternoon, I was talking to some of my students, and one thing I told them was actually, now that we've gone through this whole course called Foundations of Christian Thought, my prayer and my hope all along has been for them to be really good at just two things, which is analysis and activism. And I feel like these are the kind of things where we oftentimes as evangelicals, we tend toward one or the other, right? My sense is in this kind of class, we'll probably tend more toward analysis, and that's actually very much needed. We're recovering the evangelical mind, as it were. But then there's also the other tendency of some who want to just go full on with the social gospel, and all we do is the activism. But actually, if our analysis can inform the activism, I think there's a real sense of a biblical balance there. So that's really, at the end of the day, what it means, I think, to think Christianly and to live Christianly, as it were. So those are, we're going to apply those kind of concepts into everything from literally music to our own personal calling in life and what that means, how that's different from just say a profession or career. So quite a few things there, yes.
And why would you say that a class like that is more important now more than ever?
Goodness, it's been about 20 years since Martin Noll wrote his big and famous book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, which basically suggested that the evangelical church has sort of lost its mind and it's become almost not only not so intellectual but anti-intellectual. And so it's been 20 years, and we would hope that from that time there's been some significant progress. And to be sure, I think there has been, but I think that progress is quite kind of sparse throughout, at least the country we live in here. And so maybe to continue that work that he and some folks have started. So, am I answering your question?
Yeah. And what would you say to those who hear the word fundamentalism, and how do we as Christians interact with our brothers and sisters who are fundamentalists and also engage culture in a way that is not repelling culture?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, without going into the whole history of it, right? So modernists and fundamentalists, and I think the heart of fundamentalists is exactly right, because we're trying to recover the fundamentals of the faith. But in terms of that reaction mentality, I think we could either take one of three views in the relationship between our faith and culture. One is what's called the accommodation view, where you think of liberal professors over in the East Coast who teach at divinity schools, and they say, well, the resurrection, we all know that wasn't literal because miracles don't happen. And so we'll call it a metaphorical resurrection where Jesus rises in our hearts, and that's what we'll call resurrection. Well, that's where we're accommodating to a very secularized, liberalized academic culture. So that's obviously not the right way. So then there's the other extreme of the isolation view, which is what we're talking about with fundamentalists, perhaps, where we go ahead and create our own subculture of everything because we can't actually engage the wider culture in our society. Whereas the more biblical view, I imagine, is what we sometimes call the transformation view. So there are aspects in which we do engage and meet culture where it is, but not for the sake of simply catering to it, but ultimately to transform it. So it's neither accommodationist, where it's completely giving way to it, but we do meet it where it is. Neither is it completely isolationist, where we completely separate ourselves. Although there are some eternal truths that we need to uphold and protect. But to bring those two together and say, well, what are the things in culture that are good that we can affirm, but then what are those aspects that we can actually transform by God's grace? And so it's affirming the goodness of creation, but also recognize the fallenness of humanity. So it's the doctrines of creation and fall again. So that's kind of, yeah.
That's great. Any last questions for Rich?
Okay, so fundamentalist, you're saying isolate, or is that in that category of
I would say, yeah, tends to. Not necessarily so, right? So the fundamentalist was far earlier than, so when we think of fundamentalists today, I think, generally, we sort of have this vague notion of the 50s and 60s where the religious right eventually came into existence, and politically, they decided to have their own political party, and this is what it meant to be a Christian. So they just kind of merged their faith and their politics as one. And so that was a very fundamentalist reaction to the secularizing political society. But I think the true fundamentalists are the ones that came up about 40 years prior to that, in the 1920s, where they were really just wanting to recover the fundamentals of our faith. And in that sense, I would say that's a good thing. But again, I think we're using the term pejorative sense here in the 60s, where faith just meant, let's just politicize our faith and just marry the state. I know I'm being very blunt and very broad strokes there, but Jeremy said I can only speak for 90 seconds. I think the gentleman had here, like,
so why should one have a Christian worldview? For example, let's say a Hindu or an atheist. Let's say he's going for some marriage, and there are a lot of Christian resources, and also there are secular other resources. Why should we tell him that he has to go for Christian resources?
with respect to marriage?
Yeah, that's an example. My general question is, why should one have a Christian worldview?
Say one more time the last part. What does it mean to?
Why should someone should have a Christian worldview? Like Christians, we have a Christian worldview, Christian principles, and we do that.
Right.
But when we talk to somebody else,
Yes.
that we try to help them in a certain way in counseling, but we tell them you need to have a Christian worldview in this aspect. For example, like said marriage.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So that's a really good question, and that's a whole lecture. That's a really good question. Yeah, but I mean, some things I like to do in those kind of contexts is gosh, suppose a Muslim were to come around to us and start suggesting to us to believe in the God of Islam, and starts quoting certain surah passages and what have you, and we're thinking to ourselves, well, I'm not sure what that means because I don't even know the context for that passage, in the Quran. It's not the same, although some people like William and Craig might go as far as to say that's like literally speaking a different language. So if I only speak English, but someone's trying to evangelize to me about Islam in Arabic or German for that matter, I literally couldn't understand. So with respect to the issues of marriage, what I generally like to do is begin where they are, and I'll talk to them in terms that they do really understand. And so there's a way to talk about everything from same-sex marriage, in terms of just human flourishing, and looking at the natural order. We have actually, the Christian history has a 2,000-year-old tradition on this notion called natural law, where we can just point to the natural order and not necessarily quoting chapter and verse, although at some point I believe we have to get there. But I would start with sort of natural law language or human flourishing language, and then lead them eventually to the Word of God. So ultimately, at the end of the day, verbal proclamation is necessary, but it's only a question of, in terms of wisdom, when does that come in? But that's probably where I would start. Yeah. Oh no, this is going to be challenging. I don't know about all this. You didn't tell me about all these incredible questions. Okay, this is great. Thank you. Sure.
I want to provide others with your information of your class, so I want to know if you charge as much as Jeremy.
Well, I was asked to charge double what he because he's actually taking most of it. I mean, that's just how Jeremy works. I don't know if you really got to know me.
Unfortunately, that's too much for these folks. So, but I really appreciate your
cars out there. My car really
This is a car, yes.
Yeah.
As you can see.
Have you seen Jeremy's car?
Yeah.
We're trying to box him in, but he actually got smart. He parked outside of the area.
Would you do me a favor and thank Rich for coming? So yeah, actually, it's great to have him here because a class like that is really, really important for the church today. As you can imagine, with the issues of homosexuality being on the forefront of our minds, and the rise in divorce rates, and how to make sense of all of the scandalism we see on TV and the internet, and what to do with all that, how to respond to that. And all these figures that are Christian, that are out in the public square. You have, who announced for, Mike Huckabee announced for president, he's an evangelical Christian. Phil Robertson on Duck Dynasty being very influential in some circles. So it's like we have to figure out how to best represent ourselves in the here and now. And I think Rich is on the forefront of that, and he studied that at Oxford, as well as various other things. And he's well sought after as a speaker nowadays, and I'm very much, to be very honest with you, just shocked that I do have a friendship with this guy, because he is an incredible guy, and he's got a big birthday party this weekend, and we're excited about that. We're actually in a study group together where we go through some really challenging, rigorous philosophy together with a few others to go deeper on a bi-weekly basis and challenge ourselves. And when I first started on the radio, Rich was there, and I made so many blunders, but he was so gracious and helped me recover and helped kind of smooth it out so it didn't look like I screwed up so bad. So he's just a great guy, and we have a lot of history together already. So I'm just thrilled to be in his life. And so, in light of that, I would love for you guys to come to the class. It's 7 weeks, 8 weeks? 8 weeks. 8 weeks. So starting soon here. And if you have any questions about it, you can email me and I can send them out to Rich.
I haven't seen the attendance sheet in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, that's because I passed it out. If you're new here, can you give me your email at the bottom somewhere, and we'll get you on our email list. Thanks for the reminder. And if you were here the last few weeks, go ahead and mark yourself here. All right, so now we're back to, whoa. Now we're back to the outline. We're talking about, again, the resurrection and charges typically brought up against it. So charge number 4. Charge number 4. The disciples preached and died for fame and power and position in an emerging institution. They could have confessed about their fictitious resurrection story if they wanted to, but they had ulterior motives, so they chose to hold on to it. They wanted power during their life, and they knew that if they died for it, they would go down in history as a famous hero and co-founder of a huge religion. So the person that's bringing this charge up is typically a scholar in academia. This type of charge is very rare. You're not going to find this too much on the street, but it turns out that people are advocating for this view, that the disciples actually were willing to die for their belief in the resurrection because they would have had ulterior motives about it, and they chose to hold on to that lie. And essentially they wanted power during their life. So they held on to this belief to give them power in this emerging institution of the church. And so this charge has been seen in the literary critic Dr. Lucy Grigg, and she argues in her article there that Christian authors wrote fictions of power, she says. That is, they wrote fictions for shaping their, quote, paradigmatic Christian identity in the early church. And so this is a very important charge to respond to. So let's skip down there to where it says response. So an appeal to status and fame for the martyrs seems ad hoc and conjured up. So when we say ad hoc, we're talking about a Latin word, a couple words there that kind of means made up and conjured up. People are just saying this because they're trying to make sense of the martyrdom of the disciples. Fame and power are useless upon death. Dying for a lie is foolishness and absurd. So it's pretty obvious to us that if you go and die for a lie, you're probably not the smartest guy around, because you have an option to continue the lie and die, or to live. And if you choose the former, you're probably not the smartest person. So the point is that this is pretty absurd to make this charge and put this criticism out there. But it turns out people in academia don't mind doing it because they think they have some good backing to their view, which I don't think that's true. And you can look up that article there and check it out yourself. But let's move on past her and just think through this a little bit, because it really does help bring out the significance of the resurrection appearances and the effect that they had on the disciples. So where it says additionally, we'll pick it up there. Additionally, even if the authors did write fiction, the fact remains the disciples and others did maintain their belief. So the point is here is that even if the gospel authors wrote a bunch of lies in the Bible, even if they made up a bunch of things when they gave their account of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, okay, fine. They still maintain their belief that he rose from the grave and died for it. So you can discount the entire gospel sequences and everything in there, and you still have this piece of evidence that the disciples all died believing that the Messiah resurrected. So is it not plausible to conclude that the martyrs were actually telling the truth? So here we have a quote, people will die for their religious beliefs if they sincerely believe they're true. But people won't die for their religious beliefs if they know their beliefs are false. So no one's going to die knowing that their belief is false. But people die, especially in the Middle East these days, sincerely thinking that what they believe is true. Now, in 112, Pliny the Younger, he was a historian of Emperor Trajan. He was dismayed by the rapid spread of Christianity. And writing of the extent and variety of the Christians, he says that they are many in every period of life, on every level of society, of both sexes, in towns and villages scattered throughout the countryside. So he's saying that there's this group of Christians, and you can find them anywhere. They're everywhere. They're in every type of walk of life. So if you take a cross-section of the Roman society and the Roman Empire, across that geographical region, you'll find Christians in every society sphere. So you'll find them in the scholarly sphere, you'll find them in the begging on the curbside, you'll find them everywhere. It's not just the lowly, it's not just the scholarly. From all walks of life, there are Christians. So it is clear that the church had blossomed by 112 AD in the Roman Empire. And so whatever happened in Rome, famine, disease, earthquakes, wars, bad weather, it was blamed on the Christians who defied the Roman gods. So Christians were an important part of the Roman society by the early 2nd century. They were beaten, imprisoned, tortured, hung, eaten alive, burned to death, beheaded, crucified, stoned, disemboweled, whipped, torn apart, strangled, tossed onto the horns of bulls, had plates of hot iron pressed on them, and their dead bodies were thrown into mass graves to rot. These were the people that came before us, our predecessors in the faith. And John Fox, he documented the story of several martyrs over centuries. And he vehemently declares that nevertheless the church continued to grow, deeply rooted in the doctrine of the apostles and watered in the blood of the saints. So what doctrine was he talking about? He was talking about the resurrection. Watered with the blood of the saints, meaning that it was their blood that shed light on the truth that they were proclaiming. It is absurd to claim that people from all different walks of life and all different social strata would consent to this torture and martyrdom for fame and power. It doesn't make sense to say that all these different types of people with all these different types of jobs and personalities and family situations would all die for fame and power. That does not make sense. So for the skeptic and scholar alike, martyrdom is extremely difficult to explain away. Even if someone says it's possible that one disciple lied and died for fame, well, lying about something they all claimed was, It is an unfounded stretch to say that all the other disciples died lying about something they all claimed was empirically experienced. So yeah, you could say, okay, well maybe there is one. Maybe there is one that would have died for fame and power. Maybe one guy defected and said, you know what, enough of this. I'm going to deny him. I'm going to desert Jesus and walk away. I'm not going to live up to the truth claims that I used to hold. But it's a whole other thing to say that all of the disciples, all of them lied, would give it up and lie and die, or die thinking that, defect and say that it's a lie. And the other thing, we don't have any account of that. So it turns out that, just to skip ahead here, we don't have any alternative accounts of the disciples' death other than their martyrdom accounts. Except for John, he was exiled. But all we have are the martyrdom accounts. We don't have any other independent testimony that says that Peter died in this other way than being beheaded or crucified upside down in Rome. We don't have any other accounts. What we have is the testimonies of the early church fathers claiming how these disciples died. Yes.
If more is to be believed, they have to be egotistical maniacs, first of all. And then secondly, why are 11 of them hiding out in this upper room when Jesus appears after the resurrection?
Yeah.
So that's another one, I guess that's 14.
Yeah, I like what you said about the egotistical maniacs. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's like, what kind of a person would want to propagate this lie for fame and power? Yeah, you'd have to be an egotistical maniac. It's a good point. Yeah, Chris.
Quick question. The other books, like the Book of Thomas and these other so-called books that are out there, written by other disciples or saints, if we looked into them, I know they're maybe not canonized or nothing, but if we were to look into them, would that give us some insight to their life or what are those writings?
The early church fathers?
Yeah, and all these other so-called books that are not in the Bible. If we were to look into those, is that not good or is that
they don't have any alternative accounts of the disciples' death. The Gnostic Gospels and the other pseudepigrapha works of the time. Yeah, there's not anything like this where they talk about that. What we have is the testimony of the early church fathers about how the original disciples died, and that is what John Fox actually compiles together in a little book called Fox's Book of Martyrs. So yeah.
By the way, Fox's Book of Martyrs is available online. All you have to do is Google it. It comes out in PDF.
Yeah, I think it's free, right?
Yeah, it's huge. It's 300-something pages.
Yeah. Let's keep moving here. It says here, additionally, we're at that part here, I think it's item 12. Additionally, the disciples were Jews, raised and taught to be a good Jew, to lead such a movement that for a Jew contained lies against God and distortions of his revelation, risks one's soul being condemned to hell. So if you're a Jew and you start up a new movement in Jerusalem that has to do with there's this God-man and he's God himself, but he's here as a man and he was crucified like a criminal. If you lead that kind of a movement and you're wrong, well, you're asking for a lot of trouble in the here and now, and you're asking for eternal damnation. So you got to be very, very sure, if you're a Jew, that you know exactly what you're saying actually happened, and you're extremely, extremely certain about it. You do not want to risk the punishment of the Jewish community and your soul being condemned to hell. Now, finally, if the disciples made up a lie, if they made up a lie about Jesus resurrecting, it would be expected that at least one would confess when there were hardships and persecutions coming their way. Surely, after many, many years had passed and they were separated all over the Roman region, the 12 disciples would have become weary of this lie if they made up a lie. They would have lost motivation to keep it going, especially when they were being persecuted, when they were hungry, when they were cold, when they were famished. Maybe one of them would finally have defected and said, yeah, you know what, I'm going to come clean. We made all this up. We made it up. I can't take it anymore. Have you ever been on a road trip with a few friends? And you're just like, you get there or you're getting close and you're like, you know what, I'm over this. You guys suck. I hate you, And they're like your best friends, And so that happens a lot. You get tired of people. You get tired of the same old stuff and you want change. Well, it turns out we don't have any accounts that the disciples defected and said they were lying. So those who lie together for personal gain would also seem likely to confess for personal gain as well. Maybe somebody offered them some riches and luxury, and that could have been their personal gain. So why don't we have any reports of the disciples breaking unity and exposing the fraud that they allegedly created when they were tortured and executed? Well, the only plausible answer is they weren't lying. They couldn't deny what they saw. They couldn't deny the appearances of Jesus. It was impossible to deny what they saw. They saw so much. And so this is a very big point. Josh McDowell, who wrote The Evidence That Demands a Verdict and The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict, he became very popular in the 70s. His son, Sean McDowell, just got his PhD and did his doctoral dissertation on the martyrdom of the apostles and what that actually shows in terms of an apologetic. And so at least that's how I remember hearing it. And he's now teaching at Biola as well. And so you can check out books by him if you want. He's a great guy. Now, do we have any questions on this martyrdom? And them not, it doesn't make sense to say that they made up a lie and were tortured over and over again as they were spread apart across the Roman Empire. Any questions on that kind of response?
One question I had was, what is the general belief of the Jewish people about the resurrection of Jesus Christ?
What's the what?
General understanding of the Jewish people.
General understanding of the Jewish people?
About the resurrection of Jesus.
Well, some of them converted and some of them just rejected it.
Today?
Today? I'm not quite sure. It's a good question. Yeah. Good question. Okay, let's go to charge number 5 up here. They didn't die because what they saw was real. This is somebody saying this. It's not because what they saw was real. It's because they wanted to rebel against the Roman rule and overcome the oppressors. So the idea here is that someone would say something like, they were trying to formulate the beginnings of a movement. They were trying to organize themselves like political activists would do and raise up against the Roman occupiers, kind of Gandhi style, kind of Martin Luther King Jr. style, and do this passive resistant sort of approach by letting the Roman occupiers beat up on them and kill them and torture them. And so the person who's bringing this charge up would say that, yeah, of course, they propagated this lie and they died for their faith because eventually they just wanted the Roman oppression to end. And they were willing to sacrifice themselves because of it. Well, this is a hard thing to actually follow through with evidence. And we can respond similar to how we responded above. And also this would go against the very teachings of Jesus himself and doesn't follow through with his making sense of how Jesus acted with the Roman rulers around him. And especially when he talked about paying taxes to Caesar and giving to God what is God's, things like that. So this charge, I think, can easily be rejected in light of charge number 4's response. Let's move to charge number 6. So the martyrdom of the early church, people say, doesn't contribute evidential fact to the resurrection, just as the martyrdom of other religious radicals throughout history doesn't reveal any truth about their cause. So what they're saying is just because people die for their beliefs doesn't reveal anything about the truth about what they're dying for. Just because you die doesn't mean it's true that happened. So think of the radical Muslims today, frequently performing suicide bombings in the Middle East to defend the cause of Allah. against the infidels with hopes of attaining a prosperous life filled with riches and women. Moreover, followers of Jim Jones and David Koresh, cult leaders for those that haven't heard those names, followers of these guys went to their deaths believing a certain bad theology. So it doesn't mean that theology was true just because their followers went to their deaths. And overall, one must conclude that every fanatical zealot's cause, theology, or historical claim is not to be believed or accepted just because the zealot dies for it. So death alone does not provide the truth of something. Well, how do we respond to this? The contribution to the evidence of the resurrection is valid due to the unique situation of the disciples and other eyewitnesses. So this is important. They were in a very unique situation in comparison to the issues surrounding the founding of the other religions. The disciples believed with all of their being that Jesus died and rose again, just like the religious radicals believe with all their being that what sets them apart is their eyewitness encounters. What sets the disciples apart from all of the other founding of the other religions is the fact that the disciples had eyewitness encounters. In the case of Muslims, dying for their belief in Allah, and that Allah revealed himself as the prophet of Muhammad, this was not done in a publicly observable way. So there were no eyewitnesses when Allah gave the Quran, essentially, to Muhammad. No eyewitnesses were around. And so Muslims who put their faith in it and die for it, and they believe it so strongly that they're willing to die, could in fact be wrong because they were actually not there. And thus they cannot know it with, you can add this to your outline, they cannot know it with a high degree of certainty. Now they know it, but they're wrong. And they definitely can't know it with a high degree of certainty. So, interestingly, because they weren't eyewitnesses, and there weren't any eyewitnesses, the evidence at best is like shifting sand. You don't want to build your house on it. The same is true for Mormons and Joseph Smith, who allegedly received the Book of Mormon from an angel in a forest in Middle America. There were no eyewitnesses around. No one saw these tablets of gold given by the angel. No one saw the angel. So you have these two religions built on the testimony of one person who's claiming power, who's claiming fame, and who's probably going to get some significant financial benefit from it in the long run. In comparison, you don't have that with the disciples. You have eyewitness testimony, again, very unique, and you have suffering and torture and eventually death. So this is very profound, I think, in terms of evidence for the veracity of their claims. Now, the belief, let's skip down to Dr. J.P. Moreland's quote there in item 5. Dr. J.P. Moreland says, the disciples were able to see with their own eyes, touch with their own hands. They were in a unique position, not just to believe Jesus rose from the dead, but to know for sure. They had nothing to gain and everything to lose. And of course, we all know Lee Strobel. He says if they weren't absolutely certain, they wouldn't have allowed themselves to be tortured to death for proclaiming that the resurrection had happened. So the disciples demonstrated a high degree of certainty. And so we recognize that their eyewitness encounters, their unique position, their perspective on the unfolding of the events, puts them in a very different position than Muslim martyrs and followers of Joseph Smith. Any questions on that? Yeah.
Again, this is just something more that I have to get more knowledge on, is the religious definitely what you said with Christianity, there's nothing really to gain, versus from what I understand other religions, for example, Jehovah's, they gain something, which I'm not sure the specifics, they gain something for conversing people over. Muslims, if they do some kind of extreme acts, according to certain areas of the Quran, they gain something. So this is just what I've heard. I can't actually say that's true, but that's what I've heard. So if that's the case, in my opinion, it increased this, I guess, statement for Christians saying they died and they had nothing to gain. It wasn't, they had to persecute people to do it. It's not Christian teaching to convert. I mean, it's just wanting to live it, and you saw it, So I don't know about other religions, I don't know if that's true.
So if I understood correctly, what you're saying is that our response may need to be clarified better because some religions have adherents that actually do gain something by dying for their faith.
Dying for their faith, trying to convert.
There's a benefit.
Yeah,
She's trying to say that they work. They have to work to gain their salvation. We don't have to work. Jesus did the work for us.
Like when you're saying Muslims die, you're saying, well, what's that argument that Christians have for the faith, Muslims have for the faith? But if I understand Muslim faith correctly, and Christian faith, we don't go to heaven because we die. We go to heaven because we live in Christ. Versus Muslims, some believe they go to heaven, or they go to a certain level in heaven because they die, or because they do this extreme act.
Okay. Yeah. So that's a great issue to bring up. So if you're a Muslim and you die for your faith, and you die believing and knowing that it's true, you do get some reward for it. So that's a great point. I think it adds to our point as well, the Christian side as well, because you have someone in the here and now who's willing to blow themselves up for this reward in heaven because they know something to be true and they're willing to die for it. In the same way, the same thing happened 2,000 years ago, and people were willing to die for what they knew to be true and believed with all their heart to be true. And so that, I think, is just independent evidence, if you will, in the here and now, that people die for what they hold to be true and they don't give it up when they really believe it with all their heart.
But it wasn't like the Christians, it's not a matter of status, or it's a matter of truly just believing Jesus. You know what I mean? Not wanting to have status, not wanting to prove something, not wanting, if you really look at history and you really look at biblical accounts, it's really just because they believe. It's not because they want to get to heaven, it's not because they want to have a certain status, it's just, they saw it, they believed it.
Right. That's great. I love how you're articulating that. And I think it adds to what you're saying, adds to this point, if I'm understanding it correctly. So, I find this to be a great point because people can't bring up the charge, I think, at least, and remain in a rational position, that the disciples just lied and they died for it. What we can say, and makes the most sense, and makes the only sense, is that the disciples believed with such a high degree of certainty that they were unable to deny it, and they were willing to die and be tortured for it. And some of the torturing that was done, it kind of gets looked over in this particular type of apologetic, but when the Roman authorities wanted someone to defect from Christianity because they thought it was like a cultic sort of thing, and they wanted people to worship the emperor or bow down to the Roman gods, they would torture them. So Christians weren't just killed for the faith, they were tortured beforehand. And that Lucy Grigg scholar, she brings up this quiestro Latin word about it, which talks about how this Roman historian Ulpian talks about how the torturers would try to extract a confession, essentially saying that okay, we give up. Jesus is not God. Jesus did not resurrect. And so this koiestro was something that was done all the time with Christians. And so you have this suffering that they endured through all of these years. And I think that's profound evidence in itself, the torturing in itself, that shows that they still weren't able to actually give up their belief. So there we go. Okay, so now we're on to charge number 7, and we're actually out of time. So we'll have to pick this up next week for the last class. Dan, did you have a question?
I would make the distinction between the disciples and martyrs of any religion now. That today, as Christians, we would die for our belief. They didn't die for their belief. They knew it was true. They were there. It happened.
Yeah.
Everything else is a belief, but that was fact. It was there.
Yeah, I think that's a great distinction. When you're talking about the unique perspective the disciples had, and they died for it, now we're talking about something to build a foundation upon. And I think that the Christian faith, if you think about it, it really relies on one thing. It relies on the testimony of eyewitnesses. Eyewitness testimony, like we've talked about before, is enough to convict a man for life in prison if he committed a certain type of crime. It's the eyewitness testimony's weight that the court gives to it that makes that leverages the full strength of the law to put a man in prison or capital punishment. And so I think that if you think about Christianity and the foundation it's built on, and the 2,000 years of Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy and everything else, all the cathedrals, it's actually all built on the eyewitness testimony of certain people. And that's pretty profound. So why should we think that their eyewitness testimony is something to base our whole life on and do all this stuff and build this institution on for 2,000 years? We better be sure that those people were not making stuff up. And I think that's the point of some of what we're talking about tonight. Any last thoughts? Let's go to Wilton.
Carry it a step further. There is a difference between knowledge and truth. Knowledge is what you believe. For instance, the young Muslim that straps himself to a bomb and blows himself up waiting for the 77 virgins. I don't know what the women do when they die. But anyway, and yet the disciples, they knew truth because they saw it.
Mm-hmm.
That was truth. And when people say, I know this and I know that, it's what you believe. It's not what truth is.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the distinction here, we could draw out a little further, so thank you for that. So when we talk in our philosophy class and the worldview class, we'll talk about metaphysics and epistemology. And those big words, for those who took the class, you know what that is. But the idea is that there is this ontological truth, that's external to humans, that's mind independent. It's a reality that exists no matter who's thinking about it or no matter what we do or how we could bump into it or not. This mind independent truth that's there is the metaphysical truth of reality. Then there's the epistemology. How do we know about the truth? So what we're saying is that the martyrdom of the disciples gives evidence to their eyewitness testimony. And that the veracity of their eyewitness testimony points to this metaphysical ontological truth. So the epistemology points to the metaphysical ontological reality, if you will. Let's go to Carrie. And then we'll close here after you there.
Okay, I just had two things. One, regarding the Muslims who blow themselves up, they don't actually get a reward, they just believe they do. I just want to clarify. But the second thing was the eyewitness accounts. In court, if there's just one eyewitness, it usually isn't very weighty, because very often a person can remember it incorrectly, or they saw something
theology.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have corroborating eyewitnesses, that's when it's really powerful.
That's a great point. Yeah, thank you for that. And did you have a question?
Oh, maybe I tuned out. When everyone's talking about disciples, do you mean the 11 or the 500?
Well, that's a great question. The 11 we know were all martyred. So I guess when I say disciples, I'm referring to the formal group. And the 500 is the group of people that Jesus appeared to, that Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 15. And the 500 was, it's not known whether or not the 500 was in one place at one time and Jesus appeared and talked to them, or they were just groups of people at other places that they added up to be 500. But we would think that they all became Christians, in that sense, could be called disciples. So, yeah, good question. Okay, why don't we close there, because the questions went a little past. Could we close in prayer? God, thank you so much for tonight and the chance to look at this, and we just pray that you would enhance our faith. God, that we would know you like the disciples knew you, that we would follow you like the disciples followed you, God. And give us that kind of strength and determination and diligence, God, especially in our lives in the here and now, God. We may not be faced with martyrdom, God, but we pray that you would help us to follow you wherever you lead us in all of our lives, every aspect of our life, God. We just ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.